Rachel Whitfield stood in the doorway of the home she had built for 11 years, a single suitcase gripped in her hand, while upstairs her three children called out for her without knowing this was the last ordinary morning they would ever share as a family. Behind her at the kitchen table, her husband Michael sat frozen, staring down at a piece of paper that had just rewritten everything he believed about the woman he married. For 5 years, Rachel and Michael Whitfield were the couple everyone in Maple Ridge, Ohio pointed to as proof that real love still existed. 3 children, a beautiful home on a quiet street, a marriage that neighbors envied at every birthday party and every Sunday cookout. And then on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, Rachel walked out of that door, kissed her children goodbye, and left behind a husband who had no idea that she was carrying a child that was not his. Nobody in that town believed the story could get any worse than it already was. They were wrong. What began as a quiet betrayal inside a family kitchen would soon turn into something the entire community could not stop talking about, something that would test every single person who loved Rachel Whitfield and every person who thought they knew her. Because the woman who left that morning was not running toward a new life filled with happiness. She was running from a truth she had buried for months, a truth that was about to catch up to her in a way no one, not even she, could have predicted. And the man she left behind, the husband who had given her everything, was about to discover that the piece of paper in his hands was only the beginning of a much longer story. To understand how a marriage that looked so perfect from the outside could collapse in a single morning, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to two young people who fell in love before either of them understood what real sacrifice would eventually cost them. This is the story of Rachel and Michael Whitfield, a story that people in Maple Ridge still whisper about at church, at the grocery store, and around dinner tables years later. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rachel grew up in a small house on the edge of town, the oldest of 3 sisters, raised by a mother who worked double shifts and a father who was rarely home. She learned early how to hold a family together, how to smile through exhaustion, and how to make people believe that everything was fine even when it wasn't. Michael, on the other hand, grew up just a few streets away in a household defined by structure and quiet stability, the kind of upbringing that taught him loyalty was not a feeling but a decision you made every single day. When they met at 19, at a small diner where Rachel worked weekends to help her family with bills, neither of them expected that a simple conversation over coffee would turn into 11 years of marriage and 3 children who would one day be caught in the middle of a heartbreak they never saw coming. Their early years together were far from easy. Money was tight, their apartment was small, and Michael worked long hours at a local manufacturing plant while Rachel juggled part-time jobs and night classes, determined to build a better life for the family she dreamed of having. Friends who watched them during those years remember a couple who argued about bills but never once doubted each other, a couple who seemed to grow stronger with every hardship instead of falling apart. By the time their first daughter, Emma, was born, Michael had worked his way into a stable position at the plant, and Rachel had finally finished her degree, ready to build the life they had promised each other back at that small diner years earlier. Over the next few years, 2 more children followed, a son named Noah and a younger daughter named Lily, completing a family that friends and neighbors often described as the picture of happiness. Michael became known around Maple Ridge as the husband every wife wished she had, a man who never missed a soccer game, who cooked dinner on the nights Rachel worked late, who still brought her flowers on ordinary Tuesdays for no reason at all. Rachel in turn was seen as devoted and warm, the kind of mother who volunteered at every school event and remembered every neighbor's birthday. On the surface, nothing about their life suggested that anything was wrong. But underneath the family photos, the anniversary dinners, and the carefully maintained image of perfection, something inside Rachel had already begun to shift, quietly and slowly, in ways that even she struggled to understand. It started small, the way most things that eventually change everything usually do. A new gym membership Rachel mentioned only once. A few extra hours at work that Michael never questioned because he trusted her completely. A phone that used to sit face up on the kitchen counter now carried everywhere, even into the bathroom. None of it seemed significant on its own. None of it gave Michael any reason to worry, because in 11 years of marriage, Rachel had never once given him a reason to doubt her. But somewhere between the soccer practices and the school pickups, somewhere between the ordinary rhythm of family life that had defined their entire marriage, Rachel Whitfield made a choice that would eventually bring her to that doorway, suitcase in hand, while her husband sat frozen at the kitchen table holding proof of a truth he never imagined he would have to face. What Michael held in his hands that Tuesday morning was not a note explaining where Rachel had gone. It was something far more devastating, a piece of information that would force him to question every memory of the last several months, every late night at work, every quiet excuse he had accepted without a second thought. And as Rachel closed the front door behind her, leaving her children's voices echoing through a house that would never feel the same again, she had no idea just how far the consequences of that single morning would eventually reach, or how many lives were about to be changed because of the choice she had already made weeks before she ever packed that suitcase. To truly understand what happened inside that kitchen on that Tuesday morning, you have to go back nearly 12 years, long before Rachel Whitfield became a wife, long before Michael Whitfield became a father, back to two teenagers who had no idea that a chance meeting at a small town diner would eventually shape the rest of their lives. Rachel was 19 when she first met Michael, working double shifts to help her mother cover rent while her younger sisters finished school. She was known around Maple Ridge as the girl who never complained, the one who showed up early and stayed late. The one who carried her family's burdens quietly and never once asked for help. People admired her for it, but few of them ever stopped to ask what it cost her to hold everything together on her own for so many years. Michael was different in almost every way. He had grown up in a stable, quiet household just a few streets over, raised by parents who believed love was something you proved through consistency rather than grand gestures. He was not the loudest man in the room, and he never tried to be. What people remembered most about young Michael was how dependable he was, how he showed up exactly when he said he would, how he treated every promise as something sacred. When he first sat down at Rachel's counter and ordered coffee he never intended to finish, he was not trying to impress her. He simply kept coming back week after week until conversation turned into friendship, and friendship slowly turned into something neither of them expected to find so young. Their first years together were far from the picture of perfection people would later assume their marriage always was. Money was tight, their apartment above a hardware store barely had enough room for the two of them, and Michael worked long, exhausting shifts at the manufacturing plant on the edge of town, while Rachel balanced part-time jobs with night classes she was determined to finish. Neighbors who lived near them during those years remember a young couple who argued over grocery bills and unpaid rent, but who never once seemed to doubt that they belonged together. Rachel would later tell friends that those difficult early years were the ones she treasured most, because everything they built afterward felt like proof that hard work and loyalty could actually create something lasting. By the time their first daughter Emma was born, Michael had earned a steady position at the plant, and Rachel had finally finished the degree she had worked toward for years. Two more children followed in the seasons after, a son they named Noah and a younger daughter they named Lily, completing a family that friends across Maple Ridge often pointed to as an example of what marriage was supposed to look like. Michael became known around town as the husband every wife wished she had, the man who never missed a single soccer game, who cooked dinner on nights Rachel worked late, who still brought her flowers on ordinary Tuesdays simply because he wanted to. Rachel in turn was admired as a devoted mother, the woman who organized school fundraisers, remembered every neighbor's birthday, and always seemed to have enough patience and warmth to go around, even on her hardest days. For years, nothing about their life suggested that anything beneath the surface was beginning to change. Their oldest daughter Emma excelled at school, their son Noah spent his weekends at Little League games Michael coached himself, and their youngest Lily was just starting kindergarten, still young enough to believe her parents were the two strongest people in the entire world. Photographs from those years show a family that looked, by every outward measure, complete. Birthday parties in the backyard, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, anniversary dinners where Michael always ordered the same dessert and split it with Rachel exactly down the middle, the way he had done since their very first date at that small diner more than a decade earlier. But somewhere in the months leading up to that final Tuesday, something inside Rachel had begun to shift in ways that even she struggled to put into words. It was not a single moment or a single argument that changed things. It was smaller than that, quieter than that, the kind of shift that rarely announces itself until it has already taken root. Rachel began spending more time at a gym across town, a membership she mentioned only once in passing and never brought up again. She started staying late at work more often, always with a reasonable explanation, always delivered with the same warmth she had shown Michael for over a decade. None of it seemed significant enough to question, because in 11 years of marriage, Rachel had never once given Michael a reason to doubt her. Friends of the family who spoke about those final months later described Rachel as someone who still showed up for everyone else exactly as she always had, still remembered every birthday, still volunteered at every school event, still sat beside Michael at church every Sunday morning. Nothing about her outward behavior gave anyone reason to suspect that anything had changed. And yet in the quiet hours after the children had gone to bed, in the moments when Michael assumed she was simply tired from another long day, Rachel was carrying something she had not yet found the courage to say out loud, a truth that was growing heavier with every week that passed, a truth that would eventually walk out the front door with her on a Tuesday morning that neither she nor Michael would ever forget. Began, as these things often do, with something that seemed entirely harmless at first. A work conference 3 states away, the kind of routine business trip Rachel had taken a handful of times before without ever giving Michael a single reason to worry. She called every night that week, just as she always did, telling him about long meetings and hotel food and how much she missed the children's voices before bed. Michael had no reason to question any of it. In 11 years together, Rachel had never once given him cause to doubt a single word she said. And so when she came home from that trip slightly quieter than usual, he assumed it was simply exhaustion from days spent sitting in conference rooms far from her family. What Michael did not know was that during that trip, Rachel had reconnected with someone from her past, a man named Daniel Carver, someone she had known briefly many years before she ever met Michael, long before the diner, long before the life they had built together. Their conversation that week began innocently enough, two old acquaintances catching up after years apart, trading memories over coffee during a break between meetings. But something about that conversation lingered with Rachel in a way she had not expected, a familiarity that pulled at something she thought she had long since put away. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was simply happy to see an old friend. She continued to tell herself that for weeks afterward, even as the messages between them became more frequent, even as she found herself checking her phone more often than she used to. Over the following months, what started as occasional messages slowly became a quiet, steady presence in Rachel's life, one she kept carefully separated from everything else. She still packed lunches for Emma, Noah, and Lily every morning. She still sat beside Michael at church on Sundays. She still remembered every anniversary, every birthday. Every small detail that made their marriage look, from the outside, exactly as it always had. But in private moments, in the quiet after the children had gone to sleep, Rachel found herself pulled toward a version of her own life she had never allowed herself to imagine, one that felt, at least in those stolen moments, like something entirely her own. Michael, for his part, remained exactly the husband he had always been, steady, attentive, and completely unaware of the distance quietly growing between them. He noticed she seemed tired more often. He noticed she sometimes stepped outside to take phone calls she used to take in the kitchen. But he attributed all of it to the ordinary strain of raising 3 children while working full-time, the same strain every couple their age carried. It never once occurred to him that the woman who had built a life with him for over a decade, the woman who had never given him a single reason to doubt her, was quietly stepping into a relationship that would eventually unravel everything they had spent 11 years building together. By the time Rachel discovered she was pregnant, nearly 5 months had passed since that first conference in another state. She sat alone in a bathroom on a Thursday afternoon, staring at a test she had bought at a pharmacy 2 towns over, far from anyone in Maple Ridge who might recognize her. She did the math more times than she wanted to admit, and each time the answer stayed the same. The child she was carrying was not Michael's. For the first time since it began, the quiet, separate life she had been living suddenly collided with the family she came home to every single evening, and there was no longer any way to keep the two apart. Rachel spent the following weeks in a kind of silence Michael had never seen from her before. She told him she was simply tired, that work had been demanding, that she needed more rest than usual. He believed her, the way he had believed her for 11 years, because there had never been a reason not to. Meanwhile, Rachel wrestled privately with a decision no one around her knew she was facing, torn between the family she had built with Michael and a relationship she had allowed to grow far deeper than she ever intended it to. Friends who spoke with her briefly during those weeks later said she seemed distracted, distant, as though part of her was already somewhere else even while she sat at their kitchen table. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the result of a single dramatic discovery, but rather a slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that Michael could no longer ignore. A missed call from a name he did not recognize. A hotel receipt from a trip Rachel said had ended a day earlier than it actually had. A change in the way she spoke to him, softer in some moments, more distant in others, as though she was constantly weighing every word before she said it. On that final Tuesday morning, Michael found a piece of paper Rachel had left behind by accident, a printed confirmation from a medical appointment dated weeks earlier, one that made the timeline of everything suddenly, painfully clear. He sat at the kitchen table holding that paper as Rachel came downstairs, already dressed, already carrying the suitcase she had packed the night before, while he slept beside her without any idea what was coming. Neither of them raised their voice. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene the children would remember later, only a quiet, devastating conversation in which 11 years of marriage came apart in the space of a few sentences. Rachel told him the truth, all of it: the trip, Daniel, the months of silence, and the child she was carrying that was not his. Michael said almost nothing in return, because there was nothing he could say that would change what he now understood with complete certainty. Upstairs, Emma, Noah, and Lily called down for their mother, still believing this was an ordinary Tuesday morning like any other, unaware that everything about their family was changing in the kitchen below them. Rachel picked up her suitcase, walked past Michael without another word, and paused only briefly at the front door, long enough to call up to her children that she loved them, before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. Michael remained at the table, the paper still in his hands, staring at a door that had just closed on 11 years of marriage. What none of them knew yet, not Rachel, not Michael, not even Daniel Carver waiting for her a few miles away, was that this was only the beginning of a story that would soon involve far more people than any of them could have imagined that morning. News travels quickly in a town the size of Maple Ridge, and within days of Rachel's departure, there was hardly a household on their street that had not heard some version of what happened. Neighbors who had spent years admiring the Whitfield family now found themselves whispering a very different kind of story, one that shifted slightly with every retelling. Some said Rachel had left because Michael had changed. Others insisted Michael had done everything right, and Rachel alone was responsible for what happened. A few quietly wondered if there was more to the story than anyone yet understood, a question that would later prove far more accurate than most of them realized at the time. For Michael, the days immediately following Rachel's departure were a blur of practical chaos layered over unbearable heartbreak. He had to explain to Emma, only 10 years old, why her mother was not coming home that evening. He had to comfort Noah, who kept asking when things would go back to normal, and he had to find a way to care for Lily, barely 5, who cried every night asking for a mother who was not there to answer. Michael did not have the luxury of falling apart the way he might have wanted to, because 3 children were watching him for signs of how afraid they should be, and he was determined not to let them see just how uncertain their family's future truly was. Word of Rachel's pregnancy spread through Maple Ridge almost as quickly as the news of her leaving, and with it came a new wave of judgment directed at both Rachel and the man believed to be involved. Daniel Carver's name began circulating in conversations at the grocery store and after church services, though few people in town actually knew him personally. Some claimed he had pursued Rachel relentlessly for months. Others insisted the truth was far more complicated than a simple story of a man chasing a married woman. Michael, for his part, refused to discuss Daniel Carver with anyone, not out of loyalty to the man, but because every conversation about him only deepened a wound that was already almost too painful to bear. In the weeks that followed, Rachel attempted to reach out to her children several times, calling the house phone during hours she knew Michael would be at work, hoping to speak with Emma, Noah, or Lily without having to face him directly. Michael, though devastated, never once tried to keep the children from their mother, believing firmly that whatever had happened between the two of them, it should not come at the cost of what Rachel meant to Emma, Noah, and Lily. Those phone calls were often short, filled with long pauses and careful words, as Rachel tried to explain an absence that no child could fully understand, and as her own voice carried a weight that even she struggled to hide from them. Friends close to the family began noticing something else during those early weeks, something that would later become an important part of the story. Rachel, despite everything, seemed increasingly anxious during her calls, distracted in a way that went beyond the obvious stress of the situation. She asked about Daniel Carver less and less in conversations with her sister, and when his name did come up, she changed the subject quickly, something she had never done in the early months of their relationship, when she used to speak about him with an openness that surprised the people closest to her. Something about the arrangement she had walked into no longer seemed to match the certainty she had felt the day she packed that suitcase. Meanwhile, Michael found himself leaning on people he had never expected to need so much: his mother, who moved in temporarily to help with the children, and a small circle of close friends who quietly stepped in with meals, rides to school, and the kind of steady support that carries a person through their hardest days. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Michael began building a new rhythm for his family, one built entirely around Emma, Noah, and Lily, and around the promise he made to himself that no matter what had happened between him and Rachel, his children would never doubt how deeply they were loved. It was nearly 2 months after Rachel left that the first real crack appeared in the life she had chosen. A mutual friend, someone who knew both Rachel and Daniel Carver from years earlier, mentioned something in passing that reached Michael almost by accident, a detail about Daniel's past that no one in Maple Ridge had ever known, a detail that would soon change the entire direction of this story. It was not something Michael sought out. It found him, the way small truths in close towns often do, carried quietly from one conversation to the next until it landed squarely in his hands. And once he heard it, Michael understood that Rachel's story, the one everyone in town believed they already knew, was far from finished. The detail that reached Michael through a mutual friend was not the kind of thing anyone in Maple Ridge could have guessed. Daniel Carver, the man Rachel had left her family for, had been married once before, years earlier in a different state, to a woman he had also left suddenly, under circumstances that mirrored Rachel's situation in ways that were difficult to ignore. That marriage had ended after only 2 years, and according to the friend who shared the information, Daniel had left his first wife shortly after she told him she was pregnant, disappearing from her life almost entirely within a matter of months. Michael sat with this information for several days before he decided what, if anything, he was going to do with it. Michael was not a man who believed in interfering, and for a long time he told himself that whatever Rachel had chosen, whatever life she was building with Daniel Carver, was no longer his responsibility to question. But as the weeks passed, and as Rachel's phone calls to the children grew shorter and more strained, Michael began to notice something in her voice that troubled him in a way he could not quite explain. She sounded tired in a manner that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She sounded, more than anything, afraid, though she never said so directly, and though she never once asked Michael for help. It was Emma, only 10 years old, who first noticed something was wrong during one of her mother's calls. Rachel had promised to visit for her birthday, a promise she had made weeks earlier with excitement in her voice, only to cancel at the last moment with an explanation that felt rushed and unclear even to a child. Emma cried that night, and Michael, watching his daughter's heartbreak, found himself dialing a number he had sworn he would never call again. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice barely above a whisper. And what she told him in that conversation changed everything Michael believed about the story he thought he already understood. Rachel admitted, quietly and carefully, that things with Daniel had not unfolded the way she expected. In the months since she left, Daniel had grown distant, dismissive of the pregnancy in ways he had never been before she made the decision to leave her family for him. He had started staying out late without explanation, and more than once, Rachel said, she had overheard him speaking to someone on the phone in a tone that made her deeply uneasy. She had not told anyone, not her sister, not her closest friends, because admitting that the choice she made might have been a mistake felt harder than carrying the secret alone. Michael listened without interrupting, unsure, even as she spoke, what he was supposed to feel toward a woman who had broken his family apart only months earlier. 3 weeks after that phone call, Rachel showed up unannounced at Michael's front door late one evening, visibly shaken, asking if she could speak with him privately. She told him that Daniel had left 2 days earlier without warning, taking most of his belongings while she was out running errands, leaving behind only a short note explaining that he was not ready for the responsibility of another child. Rachel stood on the porch of the home she had once shared with Michael, pregnant, alone, and utterly unprepared for the life she now faced, a life that looked nothing like what she had imagined the morning she walked out with that suitcase months earlier. Michael did not invite her inside that night, though he did not turn her away entirely either. He told her as gently as he could manage that he needed time, that 11 years of trust could not be repaired in a single conversation on a porch, no matter how sympathetic her circumstances had become. Rachel nodded, understanding far more than she let on, and returned to a small apartment across town that she had rented weeks earlier when the strain with Daniel first began. For the first time since she left, Rachel was completely on her own, carrying a child whose father had already disappeared from the story entirely, facing a future that looked nothing like the one she believed she was choosing. What none of them yet knew, not Rachel, not Michael, and certainly not their 3 children, was that Daniel Carver's disappearance was not simply the act of a man unwilling to take responsibility. It was the beginning of a far more complicated situation, one involving debts he had left behind in 2 other states, a pattern of behavior that stretched back further than even his first marriage, and a series of decisions that would soon place Rachel, and by extension the family she had left behind, directly in the middle of consequences none of them had any part in creating. In the weeks following Daniel Carver's disappearance, Rachel discovered just how deep the trouble he left behind actually ran. 2 separate collection agencies began contacting her, assuming she was still connected to Daniel financially, informing her of debts tied to his name in Ohio, and in a state she had never even known he lived in. A former landlord called asking about unpaid rent from an apartment Rachel never knew existed. Piece by piece, Rachel began to understand that the man she had left her family for had been carrying a far more complicated, unstable life than he had ever allowed her to see, one built on the same pattern of disappearing the moment responsibility became too heavy to carry. Rachel gave birth that winter to a baby girl she named Grace, alone in a hospital room with only her sister beside her. Michael was not there, though he had quietly arranged for Emma, Noah, and Lily to visit their new half-sister a few days later. A decision he made not for Rachel's sake, but because he believed his children deserved the chance to know their sibling, regardless of the circumstances surrounding her birth. It was a small, difficult kindness, one that surprised even Rachel, who had not expected any grace from Michael after everything she had put him through. Over the following months, something neither of them anticipated slowly began to take shape. Michael and Rachel found themselves speaking more often, not as husband and wife, but as two parents trying to navigate an impossibly complicated situation for the sake of their children. Rachel, humbled by everything she had lost and everything Daniel Carver had cost her, no longer carried the same certainty she once had the morning she packed that suitcase. Michael, for his part, discovered that his anger, while still present, had slowly begun making room for something closer to understanding, though forgiveness remained a much longer road than either of them expected to travel. It was Emma, now 11, who ultimately said the words that neither adult had been willing to say aloud. During a quiet conversation with her father one evening, she asked Michael directly whether her mother could come to her birthday party that year, not as a visitor picking her up for an afternoon, but as a parent who belonged there. Michael, watching his daughter's hopeful, uncertain expression, realized in that moment that his children had never stopped wanting their mother present in their lives, regardless of what had happened between the adults. It was not forgiveness on his children's behalf that changed things. It was the simple, undeniable fact that Emma, Noah, and Lily still loved their mother completely, and that love deserved somewhere safe to exist. Rachel and Michael never reconciled as husband and wife. That door, both of them agreed quietly and without bitterness, had closed the morning she walked out of it. But over the following year they built something neither of them expected to find on the other side of such devastating betrayal, a careful, respectful partnership centered entirely around their children, one that eventually made room even for Grace, the daughter born from circumstances none of them had chosen. Rachel moved into a small house just 2 streets from Michael's, close enough that Emma, Noah, and Lily could walk between both homes, close enough that no one ever had to choose between their parents again. Looking back, the people of Maple Ridge who once whispered about the Whitfield family's collapse found themselves telling a very different story by the following spring. One about resilience rather than betrayal, about a family that had been broken apart, and somehow, imperfectly, found a way to hold itself together for the sake of 3 children who had never asked for any of it. Rachel often said later that leaving that Tuesday morning was the greatest mistake of her life, not because of where it led her but because of what it nearly cost her. And Michael, when asked by close friends how he found the strength to let her back into their children's lives at all, simply said that love. Real love, the kind built over 11 years, does not disappear the moment it is tested. It only changes shape. Today, Emma, Noah, and Lily are growing up in a home that looks nothing like the one they were born into, and yet somehow feels just as steady. Rachel and Michael still live only 2 streets apart, still show up together at every school event, every birthday, every holiday that matters to their children, choosing again and again to put the needs of Emma, Noah, Lily, and even Grace above whatever pain still lingers between them. It was never the fairy tale ending anyone in Maple Ridge expected when they first heard the story of the perfect couple who fell apart in a single Tuesday morning. But for the people who lived through it, it became something far more meaningful than a fairy tale ever could have been. A real, imperfect, deeply human story about what happens after love is broken, and 2 people choose their children over their own bitterness. Rachel has said in the years since that she carries no illusions about what she did or what it cost the people she loved most. She does not ask to be forgiven completely, only understood, and she has spent every day since Grace was born trying to become the kind of mother her children can trust again. Michael, for his part, still struggles at times with the weight of everything that happened, but he has never once regretted the decision to let his children keep their mother in their lives. He often says that raising Emma, Noah, and Lily to know real forgiveness, even imperfect forgiveness, taught them something about love that no ordinary, uncomplicated childhood ever could have. So now we want to hear from you. If you were in Michael's position, would you have found a way to let Rachel back into your children's lives, or would that door have stayed closed for good? Would you have been able to forgive the kind of betrayal Rachel put her family through, or do some choices simply cost too much to ever fully repair? Let us know exactly what you would have done in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would love to hear your perspective on a story like this. And if this story moved you, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. A story about a mother who disappeared for 3 years, and the reason she finally came home shocked everyone who thought they already knew the truth. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real emotional stories like Rachel and Michael's, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we will see you in the next story.